Life in the Wild West. When we imagine it, we think of cowboys, vast plains, and gun-slinging action. But beneath this romanticized image was a reality you probably wouldn't want to smell or see up close. Hygiene? Almost non-existent. Streets were thick with mud and manure, and bathing was more of a rare luxury than a daily routine. People shared dirty towels, reused grimy bathwater, and even made do with corn cobs instead of toilet paper. So what did hygiene mean back then? The answer may leave you grateful for modern-day conveniences. Join us as we dive into the grimy, unvarnished truth about hygiene in the Wild West, and trust us, you won't believe the lengths, or lack thereof, people went to stay clean. Let's start with the streets. Imagine stepping out of your door in a bustling frontier town. Dust kicks up, mixing with something far less pleasant: horse manure, discarded food scraps, and human waste. Streets here weren't just dusty, they were veritable playgrounds for disease. In these towns, horse-drawn carriages were the main mode of transport, bringing people and their waste right through the heart of town. The clumping hooves and wheels on dirt streets left paths not only muddy, but also dangerous. Horse manure was everywhere, spreading bacteria and attracting flies in droves. And if you thought manure was bad, it wasn't uncommon for human waste to join the mix. With no sewage systems in place, people resorted to dumping waste wherever they could, sometimes in alleys, sometimes in the middle of the street, and sometimes even just outside their front doors. The stench? It was as much a part of the landscape as the dust that settled on your clothes and food. These streets weren't just unpleasant, they were deadly. The constant presence of waste turned these towns into breeding grounds for disease. Cholera and typhoid fever, diseases that thrive in filth and poor sanitation, were constant threats. Outbreaks of these diseases swept through towns with horrifying regularity, causing townsfolk to fear the very streets they walked on. Without much in the way of medical knowledge, people barely understood what was making them sick. They just knew the streets were dangerous. Some frontier towns attempted to fight back by passing cleanliness laws, which required residents to clear the waste and muck from their immediate areas. But here's the problem. Enforcing these laws was easier said than done. In these rugged, lawless towns, enforcing something as mundane as waste cleanup often wasn't a priority. Local sheriffs were busy dealing with outlaws or other urgent matters, and with little law and order, the rule book was often ignored. Besides, who was going to tell a gun-toting cowboy to clean up his mess? This lack of enforcement left the streets in a constant state of chaos. Towns that grew quickly from mining booms or the arrival of the railroad were especially bad. The infrastructure simply couldn't keep up with the population surge, and waste piled up faster than it could be disposed of. Dust storms would carry manure and filth through the town, settling on everything from the food you ate to the clothes on your back. In fact, it was said that on particularly windy days, eating outdoors meant tasting more than just your meal. Even the basic idea of waste management was a struggle. In some places, efforts to clean the streets were so neglected that piles of waste would sit for days or even weeks, rotting under the harsh sun. Imagine trying to go about your day with that constant smell hanging over you. The sun would bake the manure and trash into the dirt streets, and it wasn't uncommon for people to feel nauseated by the sheer stench permeating the town. And the hazards went beyond just bad smells. The very dust in the air was laced with bacteria and waste particles. Every breath you took put you at risk for whatever was thriving in that grime. People knew to some degree that this was unhealthy, but there were few options. Covering your mouth or avoiding certain streets was as close as it came to disease prevention. For children growing up in these towns, the streets were a common place to play, though the playground might have been littered with broken bottles, rusty nails, and worse. It's no wonder illnesses spread so quickly among families, especially the young. Without any semblance of organized garbage or waste removal, the streets themselves became waste dumps. What some saw as an inevitable reality of frontier life, others particularly those from eastern cities, saw as pure filth. This situation also created a divide between locals and newcomers. When people from the east ventured west, they often found the towns shockingly dirty and lacking in basic sanitation. Easterners were known to comment on the barbaric state of these towns, unable to fathom how anyone could live in such conditions. But for those who had grown up on the frontier, this was just life as they knew it. Without organized clean-up efforts, the streets became a perfect breeding ground for vermin. Rats and other pests thrived in the waste-filled streets, adding another layer of danger. In fact, rats brought their own diseases, leading to another wave of health crises in towns with no hope of controlling them. The cycle was never-ending. Filth led to disease, disease led to fear, and fear led to more mistrust and isolation. In the end, the frontier streets became an unfortunate reminder that for all the freedom the Wild West promised, it came at a grimy, gut-wrenching cost. Cleanliness wasn't just a luxury, it was practically an impossibility. Hygiene, like the law, was often a matter of luck or lack of choice, and the only people who could afford any semblance of cleanliness were those willing to spend or travel to find it. The average resident, however, had little choice but to wade through the filth and hope that they didn't end up the latest victim of an unrelenting wave of disease. Let's move inside to the living conditions. If you think the streets were bad, life indoors wasn't much of a refuge. People back then didn't have the modern comforts we take for granted. For starters, beds were often nothing more than sacks filled with straw or hay, a breeding ground for bedbugs, lice, and fleas. As soon as you lay down, these tiny, unwanted roommates would crawl out, making every night an itchy nightmare. The constant bites meant that sleep was rarely restful, and it was common for people to wake up with swollen red spots from head to toe. Now, you might be wondering if they had ways to combat this. In fact, they did try. Methods included everything from shaking out the bedding to burning sulfur to kill the bugs. But most of these approaches were only mildly effective. Bedbugs, after all, are notoriously resilient. Burning sulfur, a common solution, filled homes with a choking, rotten smell, which was sometimes worse than the bugs themselves. And even with these efforts, pests always found their way back. But it wasn't just the beds that were a problem. Bathrooms, if you can call them that, were another nightmare entirely. Instead of indoor plumbing, most people relied on outhouses, which were little more than holes in the ground covered by wooden structures. Privacy was nearly non-existent, especially in crowded areas where multiple families might share one outhouse. The smell was overwhelming, and without ventilation, the outhouse was a hot, stuffy, and incredibly unpleasant experience. And in winter, imagine having to brave freezing temperatures just to use the restroom. Outhouses were so primitive that they were often a magnet for pests, and flies were almost constantly swarming around them. It wasn't uncommon for these flies, attracted by the smell, to spread diseases back into homes as they landed on food and surfaces. The outhouse, meant to contain waste, instead became a source of contamination that affected entire communities. During the harsh winter months, when trekking to the outhouse was out of the question, people turned to indoor solutions like chamber pots. Chamber pots might have made things more convenient in winter, but they posed their own problems. For one, they needed to be emptied regularly, which usually meant someone had to carry the contents outside, often through the same paths that others used. If you've ever heard the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," it originated partly because wastewater and chamber pots were sometimes emptied haphazardly into the street, often from upper-floor windows. And here's another surprise. Toilet paper was a luxury most people didn't have access to. Instead, people turned to creative alternatives. Corn cobs, old catalogue pages, or even handfuls of leaves were commonly used, though each came with its own risks. Corn cobs, while readily available, weren't exactly the most comfortable choice, and leaves could be even worse, especially if you accidentally grabbed a plant that caused skin irritation. Catalogues like the Sears Roebuck catalogue became widely used as makeshift toilet paper, though this was far from an ideal solution. These conditions, uncomfortable beds infested with pests, outhouses that lacked sanitation, and improvised, often painful alternatives to toilet paper, made daily life an exercise in endurance. Disease was rampant. The poor sanitary conditions around outhouses and the frequent use of chamber pots indoors created a perfect storm for outbreaks of diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. People understood that these outbreaks were linked to bad air or close contact, but without a full understanding of how germs spread, many hygiene practices seemed like desperate guesses at best. And what about privacy? In addition to the discomfort, outhouses lacked doors or locks, which meant that privacy was almost an afterthought. For families in crowded or communal living areas, personal space was a rarity, and hygiene became a low priority in the grand scheme of survival. Without organized facilities, the pressure to maintain any level of cleanliness was overwhelming, leading many people to simply accept that hygiene was a nearly impossible goal. In this environment, staying clean was nearly impossible. People did their best, but the tools at their disposal were minimal and often counterproductive. The endless battle against bedbugs and lice, the dreaded trip to the outhouse, and the constant threat of disease were part of life for nearly everyone on the frontier. Hygiene was more of a privilege than a right, and for most people, the grim reality was that they would never know true cleanliness. By today's standards, these conditions would be unimaginable, but for people living in the Wild West, this was normal. Many simply accepted these hardships as part of life, developing a resilience that's hard to fathom. The only true escape from these conditions was wealth. Those with money could afford slightly more comfortable beds, personal outhouses, or even hired help to handle some of the less savory aspects of daily life. For the average person, however, this was life as they knew it. It's hard to imagine, but such conditions fostered resilience and an ability to endure beyond what most of us could handle today. A lack of sanitation tools meant that families often had to create their own rules for waste and hygiene, attempting to minimize the spread of disease in ways that only partially worked. For some, especially the children, these conditions led to frequent illness, causing some to grow up with weakened immunity or chronic ailments. Survival often meant adapting, but adapting in a way that no one today would envy. Frontier life was an endurance test where only the strongest survived, and hygiene was one of those things most residents of the Wild West had to live without. Those who lived through these unsanitary conditions may have had tales to tell, but only if they could avoid the relentless tide of diseases that swept through these tough, dirty towns. It's a testament to the strength and determination of these people that despite these unbelievable challenges, they built communities, towns, and cities that would go on to shape American history. Dental hygiene is something most of us take for granted today. But in the Wild West, taking care of your teeth was a brutal affair. Toothbrushes were rare, and even when they did exist, they were often handmade with animal bristles attached to rough wooden handles. People didn't have access to toothpaste as we know it. Instead, they used whatever was available: salt, baking soda, or even crushed charcoal. But these homemade remedies only did so much. Without consistent cleaning, dental problems were common, and even young people often had rotten or missing teeth. Toothaches were as dreaded as they were common. With no painkillers or antibiotics, an infected tooth could lead to severe, even life-threatening infections. People would try almost anything to relieve the pain. Whiskey was a popular remedy. Swishing it around the mouth could numb the gums for a while, but it didn't address the underlying issues. For those willing to endure a bit more herbal medicine, certain plants like clove and wild mint were used to soothe aches temporarily. These methods offered brief relief, but they were no substitute for proper dental care. When the pain became unbearable, people turned to extraction. But here's where things got even more horrifying. Dentists were few and far between, especially in rural frontier towns. Most people didn't have access to a professional, so they turned to local barbers who doubled as dentists. These barber dentists would extract teeth with whatever tools they had on hand, often using pliers or metal tongs in a process that was anything but sterile. There was no anesthesia, no numbing gel, just raw, excruciating pain. Imagine having a tooth pulled without any relief from the agony, with only a swig of whiskey or a handkerchief to bite on. For many, dental problems went untreated for years, leading to abscesses, infections, and chronic pain. An abscessed tooth, left untreated, could lead to sepsis, a life-threatening infection that spread through the bloodstream. It wasn't just about losing a tooth. Poor dental health often led to other serious health issues. Swollen gums, decaying teeth, and mouth infections all contributed to a person's overall health decline. And once an infection spread, there was little anyone could do. Beyond the pain, people also faced the social consequences of poor dental health. Having rotten or missing teeth was a visible marker of status, as those with better access to resources could sometimes afford more regular care or even travel to see a visiting dentist. This divide created a noticeable distinction between those with and without resources in a society where self-image and reputation were highly valued. The rarity of dentists on the frontier also led to the rise of traveling dentists, who would come to town, set up shop temporarily, and charge high prices for their services. These were usually quick and brutal procedures, extractions, makeshift fillings, and sometimes basic cleanings, but they rarely lasted. Traveling dentists weren't always well trained, and many were self-taught or had rudimentary knowledge at best. While a few were skilled, most were simply trying to make a quick profit, leading to procedures that often did more harm than good. Some people resorted to extreme measures. With no real access to professional dental care, self-extraction became a last resort option. Desperate individuals would attempt to pull their own teeth using tools they had on hand. From knives to sewing needles, they would go to painful lengths to relieve themselves of a bad tooth. These desperate acts were dangerous and left people vulnerable to infections that often proved deadly. The lack of proper dental care also affected diet and nutrition. People with chronic tooth pain or missing teeth struggled to eat the tough, chewy foods common in the Wild West diet, like jerky or dried vegetables. This meant that many people were limited to softer, often less nutritious foods, which contributed to malnutrition and weakened immune systems. In a land where food options were already limited, dental issues could lead to serious health consequences far beyond the mouth. Public spitting, which was commonplace in the Wild West, only worsened the problem. Spittoons were often provided in public spaces, but the habit of spitting spread diseases like tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was known then, was a highly contagious and deadly disease, affecting countless lives on the frontier. Efforts were later made to pass spitting laws to control the spread of disease, but these laws were inconsistently enforced. By the time towns implemented these laws, public health had already suffered greatly. Overall, dental hygiene, or the lack of it, was a significant factor in the poor health conditions of the Wild West. The constant threat of infection, the lack of professional care, and the pain and social stigma associated with missing or rotten teeth painted a grim picture of daily life. For most, dental hygiene was simply a matter of luck and endurance, and even basic care was a luxury few could afford. Looking back, it's almost unimaginable what people endured just to survive, and the lengths they went to just to relieve a simple toothache. While they might not have known exactly what caused these problems, they knew enough to fear them. The resilience of these people is astounding. They pushed through pain that we'd consider unbearable, all without the benefits of modern medicine. In a time when just getting by was a daily struggle, dental hygiene was often the least of their worries. If there's one thing that the Wild West didn't have much of, it was water. Bathing was often seen as a luxury, and for many people, it wasn't even a monthly activity. The frontier was a dry and dusty place, and water wasn't just for bathing. It was essential for drinking, cooking, and for animals. So when water was scarce, bathing took a back seat to survival. For cowboys, miners, and pioneers, regular bathing just wasn't realistic. They would go days, sometimes weeks, without a proper wash, and the result was a smell that would stick to them and their clothes. Cowboys, who spent most of their time outdoors, were notorious for their strong body odor, something they couldn't avoid, given their limited access to water and soap. Miners faced a similar situation. After a long day working underground in cramped, dark and dusty conditions, the idea of a hot bath was simply out of reach. When people did bathe, it was often in small, shared tubs. Families or groups would fill one tub with water, and everyone would use it in turn, starting with the oldest or most respected family members. By the time the last person got in, the water was cold, murky, and thick with dirt. It wasn't unusual for children, who usually bathed last, to sit in water that looked more like muddy soup than anything clean. This shared bathing practice was a reality for most families on the frontier. Water had to be fetched from wells, rivers, or lakes, and hauling it in buckets was a labor-intensive process. Heating it required firewood, which took time to gather and prepare. So if a family was lucky enough to have a bath, they made the most of it, reusing water for each member and even saving it for other purposes afterward, like washing clothes or cleaning tools. But even when water was available, the quality wasn't guaranteed. Rivers and lakes were often contaminated, either from livestock waste, mining runoff, or natural minerals that made the water taste foul. Water sources were also breeding grounds for bacteria, and people who bathed or drank from them often got sick. Diseases like dysentery and cholera were common, and for those who didn't know better, water was often more of a hazard than a help. Mining towns had it even worse. Operations upstream frequently contaminated the water with mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances used in extracting precious metals. This pollution poisoned the water for entire communities downstream, affecting their drinking water and even causing illness from simply bathing in or coming into contact with these contaminated sources. But with few alternatives, people continued using whatever water they could find, unaware of the long-term health effects. Bathing itself was often done in unconventional ways. If a bathtub wasn't available, people would use basins or even buckets to splash water on themselves, scrubbing as best they could with rough, homemade soap. The soap was another issue. It was usually made from animal fat mixed with ashes, a combination that could leave skin feeling dry and irritated. This soap wasn't scented or softened like what we have today, and after a rough scrub, people often felt just as dusty as before. Women faced their own unique challenges. With long dresses and heavy petticoats, even attempting to stay clean was difficult. Washing long hair took time and a lot of water. So many women kept their hair braided or pinned up, only washing it every few weeks or even months. Improvised combs and oils were used to manage hair and keep it from tangling. But this was hardly enough to keep dust and dirt from settling in. Cowboys, miners, and pioneers also dealt with water shortages in their own ways. For some, a quick rinse in a river or lake sufficed, though this was rarely possible for those working in isolated areas or dry regions. Cowboys, who were often on the move, might go weeks without encountering a fresh water source. In place of bathing, some would rub their skin with dirt or sand, hoping to absorb some of the sweat and oil that accumulated. Though this might sound strange, it was sometimes the only option to feel a little cleaner in the absence of water. Laundry was equally challenging. Washing clothes was an all-day affair, and drying could take even longer, especially in colder months. Clothes were usually made of heavy, durable materials like denim or wool, which didn't dry easily. As a result, people wore their clothes multiple times before washing them, and it wasn't uncommon for a single outfit to be worn for days on end. Washing was done by hand, often using a washboard and soap made from animal fat, which was effective but harsh on both the skin and fabric. Chinese immigrants, who were known for their meticulous laundry skills, contributed greatly to laundry practices in the Wild West. Many opened laundries, becoming well regarded for their ability to clean clothes despite the lack of fresh water. These laundries became vital in larger towns, helping people maintain at least a minimal standard of cleanliness in otherwise grimy conditions. For most people, however, regular bathing remained out of reach. Bathhouses, where they existed, offered a chance to enjoy a real bath, but these were often costly and located in larger towns. Saloons sometimes offered baths as well, though hygiene standards varied widely. With communal towels and reused water, bathhouses and saloon tubs weren't always as sanitary as one might hope. People bathed where and when they could, but the average frontier resident simply lived with the grime, carrying on despite the dust, dirt, and scarcity of water. In the end, bathing in the Wild West was a rare event, often limited to once a week or even once a month for many people. The lack of consistent hygiene left people exposed to skin infections, illnesses, and an environment that encouraged disease. Today, we take clean running water and soap for granted, but on the frontier, hygiene was another one of those luxuries that most could only dream of. Hair and clothing hygiene in the Wild West presented another set of challenges for settlers. For starters, caring for hair was no simple task. Washing hair required a lot of water, which wasn't always available. When women did wash their hair, they often used soaps made from animal fats and ashes, homemade mixtures that left hair feeling rough, dry, and often tangled. Without conditioners or modern shampoos, this basic soap was harsh, stripping natural oils and making hair brittle. To combat this, women and men often turned to makeshift oils, sometimes made from animal fat or natural sources like olive or castor oil, to keep hair somewhat manageable. However, the dust and dirt from daily life quickly settled into hair, often making it feel just as unclean after washing as before. Women typically kept their hair tied back, braided, or pinned up to reduce the frequency of washing. Washing and drying long hair could take hours, so it was a process saved for special occasions or rare opportunities when water was abundant. For cowboys and other frontiersmen, hair care was equally low on the list of priorities. Living outdoors for long stretches, often on cattle drives or out on the range, these men didn't have the time or resources to worry about cleanliness. Instead, many kept their hair short, and facial hair was a common choice, with beards and mustaches offering some protection from the elements. But the constant exposure to dirt, dust, and sweat led to hair that was perpetually grimy. The same scarcity of water and soap that made bathing difficult also impacted laundry. Washing clothes was an arduous, time-consuming process. Without access to washing machines, people relied on washboards and tubs, scrubbing each piece by hand. This was especially challenging in colder months when water would freeze quickly, forcing people to break ice before washing. Laundry was often left to dry outside, and in winter, it could take days for clothes to dry completely. People typically wore the same outfit multiple times before washing, as washing was seen as a major chore. Settlers favored sturdy, durable fabrics like wool and denim, which held up to the harsh conditions of the frontier but made washing even more challenging. Denim, for instance, could be heavy and stiff, especially after washing, and drying took considerable time. Wool, while warm, was difficult to clean and prone to holding on to odors, sweat, and dirt. Given the effort required to wash and dry these materials, clothes were often worn as long as possible between washes. Many frontier families devised ways to make clothes last longer without frequent washing. They would air out clothing, brush off dust, and use handkerchiefs or neckerchiefs to protect collars from sweat stains. Aprons, too, were a popular garment for both men and women, acting as a barrier against grime. These efforts helped reduce the need for frequent laundering, but they couldn't completely eliminate the buildup of dirt, sweat, and odors. Chinese immigrants played a significant role in establishing laundry practices in the Wild West. As towns grew, Chinese laundries became essential businesses in many communities, offering settlers an option to get their clothes cleaned with greater care and efficiency. Chinese launderers used meticulous techniques, taking pride in their work and often charging competitive rates. For many townspeople, These laundries were a vital service, especially for those who wanted to maintain a semblance of cleanliness despite the dust and dirt of daily life. However, not everyone had access to a laundry service. For those in remote areas, washing clothes remained a grueling task, and some simply accepted the grit of daily life. Communal laundry days were common among families or in small communities, where women would gather by a river or stream, washing clothes together. These gatherings became a rare social occasion, where people exchanged news and shared stories as they scrubbed clothing by hand. In saloons and communal lodgings, such as boarding houses, shared towels and bed linens were the norm. This created a particular hygiene issue, as the frequent use of shared items allowed for the easy spread of lice, bedbugs, and other pests. The communal nature of frontier life meant that cleanliness was often sacrificed for practicality, with people simply accepting that shared spaces and belongings would come with certain risks. In such a dusty and rugged environment, hygiene was always a challenge, and hair and clothing were among the first to show the effects of life on the frontier. Today, we might view the Wild West as romantic, but the reality was far from glamorous. Living in an era without the conveniences we enjoy today, people had to adapt to the harsh conditions, making do with what they had. Hair care and clothing hygiene were often sacrificed to prioritize survival, and those who managed to keep their clothes or hair even remotely clean were considered quite fortunate. Communal spaces in the Wild West were both the heart of social life and a constant hygiene challenge. Saloons, boarding houses, and even general stores were shared spaces where people gathered for food, shelter, and a sense of community. But the close quarters and shared amenities brought a host of hygiene issues, making these places ideal breeding grounds for disease. Let's start with the saloons. Saloons were popular gathering spots, offering a place for locals and travelers alike to grab a drink, catch up on town gossip, and rest for a while. But with such frequent foot traffic, hygiene was often an afterthought. In an effort to keep up appearances, saloon floors were commonly covered with sawdust. This sawdust helped absorb spills and provided traction, but it also absorbed everything else: spit, spilled alcohol, blood, and even food waste. Over time, it became a layer of filth that could never truly be cleaned, adding to the overall grime of the environment. In addition to the floors, shared drinking glasses were common in saloons. While some establishments made an effort to rinse them, the quality of cleaning varied greatly. For many people, wiping a glass with a towel was good enough, but towels were communal as well and quickly became soiled. Shared towels, along with dirty glasses, were a prime means of spreading diseases like tuberculosis and colds, illnesses that thrived in these busy, close-contact settings. Saloons weren't the only communal spaces with hygiene issues. Boarding houses, where travelers and locals alike found cheap accommodations, had their own unique set of problems. In these spaces, beds, linens, and even rooms were reused with minimal cleaning. Bed linens and blankets were rarely washed, and as more and more people cycled through, bedbugs, lice, and fleas became regular guests. The quick turnover and lack of sanitation allowed these pests to spread quickly from one traveler to the next. For many, an overnight stay in a boarding house meant waking up itchy and uncomfortable, often covered in bites. Privacy was another rare luxury in boarding houses, which were usually shared spaces with thin walls or curtained partitions. Restrooms, if they existed at all, were shared by many, and maintaining any level of cleanliness was challenging. Communal sinks and wash basins, shared by all tenants, became sources of germs and grime. As a result, these places were hotspots for the spread of contagious illnesses. Public spitting was another significant hygiene issue. Spittoons were placed around saloons and public areas to encourage people to spit in one place. But this didn't always work. People often spat on floors, streets, and even indoors, adding to the already unsanitary conditions. Spitting was a common habit, but it came with major health risks. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, was widespread, and spitting played a role in transmitting this deadly disease. In time, towns began implementing spitting laws to combat the issue, but enforcement was sporadic, and the habit persisted well into the early 20th century. In addition to saloons and boarding houses, general stores and communal dining areas presented their own challenges. Shared eating utensils, cups, and plates were standard in places where settlers and travelers gathered to eat. People passing through often didn't have personal utensils or dishware, so establishments provided communal items. But in a place where sanitation practices were minimal, this meant that bacteria and germs spread easily. A simple meal could expose someone to a range of illnesses, all from the shared surfaces and utensils that everyone relied on. Churches and meeting halls, while central to social life, were also potential sites for the spread of disease. Weekly gatherings brought people from all over the community into close contact, and without modern ventilation or heating, these spaces were often cold, damp, and crowded. Illnesses spread easily in such conditions, especially during the colder months when people gathered indoors to stay warm. For women, communal spaces posed additional challenges. Heavy dresses and multiple layers of clothing made hygiene difficult, and using restrooms in public spaces was awkward, to say the least. In some cases, women wore crotchless pantaloons under their skirts, making restroom use easier but still far from convenient. Given the lack of privacy, women faced extra difficulties maintaining personal hygiene in public. Life in the Wild West was communal by necessity, and that meant hygiene was often compromised. The close quarters, shared spaces, and lack of sanitation were part of the reality of frontier life. People adapted, but the consequences of these communal habits were felt in the spread of illness and discomfort. While today we might take personal space and sanitation for granted, for people on the frontier, these luxuries were simply out of reach. The hygiene horrors of the Wild West are a reminder of just how much we take for granted today. From shared, pest-ridden beds and contaminated water sources to crude dental practices and communal spaces rife with disease, frontier life was anything but clean. Yet, despite these grim conditions, people adapted, survived, and even thrived in their own way. It's a testament to their resilience in the face of unimaginable challenges. If this glimpse into the past left you grateful for modern hygiene, hit that subscribe button for more explorations into history's untold stories.